Hi, everyone. Welcome to our devotion for Tuesday, May 12th, on the prophet Amos. The reading is from Amos chapter 5, verses 18 to 24. The prophet says, "Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Here ends the reading. So on Sunday, I talked about the prophet Elisha. And after Elisha died, the split kingdoms of Israel and Judah continued on with various times of open conflict, but mostly a kind of stalemate peace. Unfortunately, we don't have much in our Bible about the prophetic activity after Elisha until we get to the prophet Amos. The book attributed to Amos is categorized as one of the 12 minor prophets, separate from the major prophets, not because of importance, but because of length. The book of Amos is important for many reasons, one of which is that it is the earliest existing Old Testament book. It predates every other history, writing, prophet, or other piece of writing that we have. So if you want to interpret Genesis, Exodus, really anything else in the Old Testament, there's two things that you have to be familiar with. Number one is the Babylonian exile. Number two is the book of Amos. But unlike what we've previously read, this book is much more interested in what Amos said than in what he did, which is where this gets confusing, right? The stories we've read so far about Moses and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha were written as stories. There was character, there was plot, there's times and places, and all of these led these stories of what these people did, making them memorable. But the books of the prophets, like Amos here, are mostly collections of what they said, and there's not always a lot of story elements mixed in. I think it's a fair assumption to make that most of the original listeners to these already knew the story parts, so they just recorded the sayings to remember them. But that's not so true anymore. We are just not that familiar with these stories from so long ago, so we have to rely on both traditions and scholars to help us understand what's going on when they comb through the text and figure things out. So who was Amos? When you read through the book, Amos will mention that he is a shepherd and a field laborer from Tekoa, which is a small village about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. So this is in the southern kingdom of Judah. But he says multiple times that he is prophesying in Bethel, which is one of the major sanctuaries of the northern kingdom of Israel. So a guy from the south has come up to preach in the churches of the north. He is not a welcome figure, and it is not a welcome message. Amos emphasized that he was not a professional prophet. He did not come from that community of prophets that Elijah and Elisha were a part of. He was just a poor, low-class farm worker, not even a farm owner. But he felt like God was calling him to speak out against the rich and wealthy and powerful who were oppressing the lower classes by things like not paying enough wages, making them work for too long, for not enough, some of the same things we're hearing today. When I think of Amos, I think of stories I've heard of Cesar Chavez and cultural leaders like him. That's the touchstone for Amos. Amos was active around 760 BCE, which is about 100 years after Elisha died. And this was during a time of relative peace and prosperity, which is a terrible time for a prophet. When everything's going wrong, we're thrilled to hear some good news from God. That's why I've been doing these devotions and videos more during this time of pandemic than I ever did before, or hopefully ever will after. That, and I'm just bored, right? But when everything is going fine, when everything is good, when the stock market is up, jobs are plentiful, and the status quo is working out fine for you and everyone you personally know, then we wonder why God would stick that great big heavenly nose all up in our business. Why can't we just have the nice things? Amos reminds us that nice things don't always last. And nice things for us aren't necessarily nice things for everyone. He spoke against the disparity of wealth distribution. The rich kept getting richer because the poor kept getting poorer, which was not the way God designed the society to work. God had instructed the Israelites to maintain an equilibrium in their community, in their country, that what little wealth there was supposed to flow from one to another, so that no one had too much and no one had too little. Remember when we talked about the manna in the wilderness, where the people would go out and gather what they needed for the day, but when they came in and measured it, it was the right amount. No one could gather too much or too little, and if they tried to gather too much and they tried to hide it, it spoiled and it smelled bad. That was God's intention for everything in the community of the Israelites, that everyone would have enough. But instead, there grew up some major disparities between a rich upper class and the poor working class, like Amos. Some of the things that Amos said tell us what he's been seeing. He says, "They sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way." Or he said, "They hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins, you who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, and push aside the needy in the gate." Amos defines the righteous as the people who live in right relationship with God and other people. Those who follow God's laws, not just in relation to God, but in relation to each other. But it's really easy to take advantage of someone who follows God's way if you yourself don't care. Like when Jesus said that if somebody strikes you on the face, you're supposed to turn the other cheek so they can hit you again. Well, that's supposed to make your attacker feel silly, stupid, and ridiculed. But that only works if your attacker has a sense of shame and a flicker of empathy. If not, your attacker will just keep hitting and you will just keep turning. So Amos is seeing unscrupulous people take advantage of the kindness and generosity of others, in effect buying and selling people for worthless things that we just want. Or worse even than that, he sees the lack of generosity and compassion of the rich and the wealthy, ignoring those who they have to step on to get ahead, those who have to be pushed aside in order to climb that ladder. And then he sees that these vain, greedy, and selfish people don't like it when the righteous ones, like Amos himself is trying to do, try to correct their behavior. The city gate back then, one of the functions was that it was the community's courthouse, where people would meet to have their arguments and discussions, and where the judge or the wise person would be to help navigate these discussions and help come to a reasonable solution. When somebody's trying to remind you of your proper place and your proper station, of your responsibilities, instead of just yelling louder and louder about your freedoms. Amos is telling us that these irresponsible people will face God's judgment. Our reading today from the middle of the book begins Amos's prophecy about the day of the Lord, that promised time when God would reach down again, like God did during the Exodus, to fulfill all of God's promises. But Amos warns us all that the day of the Lord is not necessarily going to be a good day for a lot of people. He uses the image of a locust swarm consuming everything. So if you have something you are not willing to lose, this is going to be a bad day. Wealth is no protection against this invasion of God into our world. Amos says, "On the day I punish Israel for its transgressions, I will tear down the winter house as well as the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall come to an end. There won't even be another house to run into to be safe." Amos even speaks out against the worshiping practices of the people, saying things like worship and sacrifices and festivals and holidays mean absolutely nothing to God if the society doesn't treat the least and the lowest with justice and righteousness. So how do we avoid God's judgment? Amos will say we can't. We are all going to be judged by God. But Amos does tell us that we can choose as much as we are able to live in God's ways and be judged as one of the righteous ones. He says, "Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you just as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph." And yes, we can talk about what is the just and right action for all kinds of situations, and in fact we must, in order to make our society what it's supposed to be. And the way that we use our money, the way that we operate our financial systems of our world is so very important to the life and well-being of people. And not just because not enough money means no housing, no food, no shelter, no medical care, no necessities of any kind. People are literally starving to death. But also because there is such a thing as too much. But we've never been taught how to understand enough. We always seem to think that enough is just a little bit more than we already have. But of course, then there is never enough, because even when we get that little bit more, there's still something more than that. Amos reminds us that in God's world, there is justice, there is fairness, there is enough. And God needs us, the righteous ones, to do that work in this world. We can't just operate in the world as normal, just pass everything by, and then come to church on Sunday and pray that we'll work different today, and then go back to the way things go on Monday. No, we are God's people in the world every Monday too. And Amos tells us that we need to act like that. In another popular story from this book, God shows Amos a plumb line. That line that's used to measure whether a wall is being built straight vertical or if it's crooked, right? Like I would just always be the crooked line. I just can't handle this. God says that God will measure us according to God's purposes and intentions. This plumb line of God. We are supposed to line up with God, not expect God to line up with whatever we want. Of course, this all means that Amos was not looked very kindly upon when he brought this message to Israel from Judah. Part of the story we get in the book of Amos is how the priest of Bethel, his name was Amaziah, complained to the king of Israel, Jeroboam, and how Amaziah tried to have Amos physically removed and sent back south by force, which some scholars believe is exactly what happened. This would be like running your pastor out because you weren't happy with the sermon. Of course, that happens a lot too, so what are we going to do? Later tradition will tell us that Amos was killed by one of Amaziah's sons, who tracked him down to Jerusalem, making Amos one of those prophets killed in Jerusalem that Jesus mentions, which is fitting that Jesus would equate his ministry with Amos's prophecy. So much of what they said mirrors each other. In fact, if you took your old-fashioned red letter Bible that highlights the words that Jesus says in red ink, you'd have to highlight a lot of the book of Amos as well. Jesus and Amos use the same words and the same ideas to try and get their point across. Even as a minor prophet, Amos was and still is significant and important for us, for our understanding of God, for understanding our place and our work in God's world. And for that, I give thanks to God. God bless you today.